Welcome back. Alastair Campbell, well, probably best known as Tony Blair's chief spokesman and strategist, it's his work as a mental health advocate which is arguably his most life-changing. Author of several best-selling books, his most recent, Living Better, How I Learned to Survive Depression, is described by Stephen Fry as a book that could save lives. In recognition for Alastair's extraordinary role in helping to break down the stigma surrounding mental illness, he was awarded an honorary fellowship of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in 2017. We are delighted to have him here, and a huge welcome, Alastair.
Thank you.
Just starting off with the book, what was your motivation for writing it?
I'd never know. It's my 17th book, so...
Right.
And you never quite know where it's coming from, but I think the basic motivation was I'd done a TV programme exploring depression as a theme. And the thing about television, you can, for a 1 hour programme, you've got hundreds of hours of stuff. I spoke to some really interesting people. And so, for example, one guy I spoke to for 2.5 hours, I think he got one clip on the programme. I thought, I've got all this stuff there, what do I do with it? So I started to kind of shape it into something. Then I thought, well, I know what publishers are like. They want the personal stuff as well. So I decided actually just to turn it into a kind of mental health memoir, really. But with these kind of, if you like, strategies and tips and guides to how I've learned to survive depression in the hope that it might help other people. And then the other thing that's in there is my partner, Fiona, who's obviously kind of lived with it for 40 odd years now. She's written a chapter about what it's like living with me in my various moods. And that's actually had as much connection and cut through to people as anything, I think, because I think it's not just about the person who has depression, there's all those people around them and the effect it has on them.
Yeah, coming back to that in a bit, but do you think it's extraordinary, I think, that even today, that someone as high profile as yourself talking about depression, talking about mental health in this way still seems to be the exception rather than...
I know, and do you know what? It's like, it slightly gets on my nerves. It's like, I go to all these events and there'll be me, Ruby Wax, Stephen Fry, who you mentioned, and Frank Bruno. Yeah. And it's like, people will say, isn't it great we're all talking about it? And I'll say, well, there's not many of us talking about it.
Well, quite.
And it's, in Parliament, for example, there was a debate a few years ago, and people said, oh, it's extraordinary. 4 MPs spoke out about their own mental health struggles. Well, I know a lot of MPs, and I know there are a lot more than 4 who are struggling. And so I never say to people, listen, you've got OCD, you should talk about it, or you have chronic anxiety, get out there and campaign. It's a very personal thing. But I do think that the way I see this campaign is trying to get to a place where we feel we can be as open about our mental health as we are about our physical health. And we're a million miles away from that.
Quite, and yet, obviously, over the last 12 months, it's clearly risen up the agenda, and more people are talking about it than ever before. I was reflecting on it the other day, and for the first time, whenever you start a Zoom call, you ask someone how they are, and they ask how you are, and for the first time ever, it feels like you actually mean something. Quite. So how do we build upon that momentum?
Well, I worry about what happens after this, because I think there's going to be, for obvious reasons, once we're through all this sort of nightmare, people are so wanting to just kind of get on with things. And I worry that there won't be the proper learning of lessons, and there won't be actually looking at the things that we can take from this. So, for example, I think you're right that people who've got no experience of mental illness, mental ill health, have maybe thought, I sort of get a little bit what it might be like now, because I've been anxious or I've been worried about the kids or whatever it might be. But I worry that on the back of that, you'll have more and more people thinking, maybe I need a bit of help. And the services aren't there. And that's why, by the way, is why I was very happy to do this event. I do think that businesses as employers have got a massive role to play in this. I think in some ways, I think even more important than government. I mean, without getting too political, I don't much trust this government to get the mental health agenda. And I think that I've seen some of the businesses, funny enough, we're here, in Blackfriars, not far from the city. Amazing how many of the big financial institutions came out of the crash, lost people to suicide, lost a lot of people to stress, and said to themselves, do you know what, we need to change the way we do this. And I did an extraordinary event online the other day with the Bank of Ireland, where the chief executive introduced me and said to 3,000 people all online, the whole staff of Bank of Ireland, it was an all-staff meeting, and said, from today, our number one priority, above all else, is the mental health and well-being of our staff. Because unless we get that right, we're not going to meet all the other business challenges that we face. Now, that, I think, was just it was such a great thing to hear.
Yeah, incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
We've certainly seen some instances like that across the retail sector over the last 12 months. I guess the challenge will be as stores have reopened a few weeks ago, and there's a drive to get cash back through the tills,
Sure.
drive profits back, make up for lost time. Is the fear then that as we return to a world where profit becomes king, that some of the stuff that the ground that we've made up in the last 12 months will be lost?
I think that is a fear. And this may seem strange, but it's kind of front of mind at the moment because I've got another book out at the moment, which is my diaries covering 2010 to 2015. And I've subtitled it The Rise and Fall of the Olympic Spirit. Now, if you think about that, 2012 was just incredible.
Yes.
London 2012, if you were in London at that time, it was just the most amazing feeling. And I used to say, God, if only we could bottle up this and build on it. Well, it's gone.
Yeah.
It's gone in terms of the way the country feels. It's gone in the way that there's been no sort of follow-through investment in sport and Olympic legacy. And so I do worry. I worry that unless you have that people in positions of leadership, government, yes, but also in positions of leadership in business and across the trade unions and across the whole sort of social, political and economic sector, then things don't change unless you make them change. And I worry, if you think about, I read a book recently about the Spanish flu, and it was like, when it ended, there was just this sort of desire, let's never have to think about that again.
Right.
You move on. Well, that's a very natural human
Yes.
response, but I think sometimes it's worth looking back and thinking, well, what's in that we should keep? The whole work-life balance, I think people are going to have to look at. I've been amazed at how, when 2 years ago, I can remember a meeting at one of the companies that I work with, and you had all the young people there saying, why do we have to commute every day? When we can do so much of this on a laptop, we could do it at home. And you had the older people saying, no, it's very important for the morale and building a team and all that sort of stuff. Now, I've noticed there's been this generational shift where the young people stuck at home in a bedsit or working off the end of the bed and their boyfriend or their girlfriend are over there, or they've got kids homeschooling, all that stuff, are thinking, I can't wait to get out and get to the office. And the older people who've got maybe a bit of space and a garden and they've worked out how to do the technology. And so I think all that sort of stuff, I think it's really worth thinking about how has that affected people up here?
Yeah.
And what can we keep? And what can we get rid of?
And how has the last 12 months, do you think, changed people's levels of anxiety, affected mental health?
It's very hard to tell. I can only really, the fact is because we haven't really been seeing other people so much. I've noticed two things actually. One is I've still got depression and I still get a bit of mania from time to time, but I've noticed that my physical health has been vastly improved.
Right.
And I think that's to do with flying.
Okay.
Right? I used to fly around all over the place and constantly busy, doing too much. And now I'm starting to think, I don't want to stop traveling and I want to get places, but I'm definitely thinking, maybe I need to dial down a bit on that. I think for other people, if you just go through it, there's some new mental health charities are starting up in relation to frontline workers, the mental health consequences for frontline workers. While you and I were able to say, right, well, we've been ordered to stay at home, we'll stay at home. They were going out. They were often not protected, didn't have the proper PPE, didn't have the proper equipment. They're facing death and suffering on a scale that, they've maybe not had to deal with before. That has consequences.
Yeah.
Then you think about, for example, students or children in school who are, they're working hard, they're working up to exams, and then you had that whole fiasco with the algorithm. Will they be judged by the teachers? Not. And then, or students who go to university, they're still paying the fees, and they're stuck in a bedsit. Looking out the window all day because they're not allowed out. And then the economic consequences, families really struggling, businesses struggling. Dare I say, throw Brexit into the mix.
Yeah.
I saw the Food and Drink Federation stuff the other day. I thought, oh my God, that's affecting a lot of businesses. So that's going to affect mental health as well. So, and I worry that from government perspective, I don't have any sense of there being a strategy for this. They don't, at least David Cameron and Theresa May used to talk about it.
Yes, yeah.
They used to say, look, I want mental health to be a priority. It seems to me to have gone back to the back of the queue. And listen, I get that. I get why the COVID, just dealing with the pandemic, is so important. But you mentioned the Royal College of Psychiatrists.
Yeah.
They have said they worry that mental illness will be the second pandemic coming out of this.
Right.
So
therefore, if there is this gap, and there's an awful lot of talk about us given this opportunity to build back better, whatever that may mean, what is the role of business, and where is the line drawn between the responsibility of government and society, the responsibility of industry, and then even actually, the responsibility of individuals as well? Where do you think that the lines are drawn?
Well, I do think, one of the lessons sounds really patronising, but one of the things that I've tried to draw out in the book is that, it doesn't say how I learned to beat depression, how I learned to survive depression. And a lot of it is actually, I have taken that responsibility for myself. Now, I take medication. I see a psychiatrist from time to time when I'm really bad. But I do things that I didn't do before. I look after my diet. I exercise every day. I really try to get enough sleep to make sure that my brain and my mind are kind of settled. And they're things that we can all do. And then also, I think the other thing that I do is I try to focus, particularly when I'm struggling, I try to focus on those things that really matter to me. Key relationships, my music, football, my football team, my bike, these things that matter to my dog. Now, we all have those things, and I think what I do, for example, when I'm starting to feel a bit edgy, I have this motto: read books, not newspapers, listen to music, not the news. Okay. Now, these are all things that I think we can all say to ourselves, right, I know I have to take some responsibility for myself for how I am feeling.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes there's nothing I can do. The depressive cloud comes in and I'm gone. But I deal with it better than I used to. So that's the personal responsibility. I think we all can do that. Then I think within business, I do think employers can do tons of stuff. And I think they can do it, by the way, not from a sort of, we're going to take on the role of the NHS and we're going to be the nanny state and all that. I think they can come at it from a much more hard-headed position. We will be a better, more profitable, more successful organisation if we have got a happy, healthy workforce. And happiness and good health is as much about this as it is about this. And I think actually those companies that have got the ability for their staff to say when they're struggling, and it's not going to be a problem. Any more than when you come in and when somebody comes into work and they've got flu and they're sniffing and they're snorting, you just want them to go home, right? Because you don't want to catch it, right? Particularly now. Well, actually, it's not the same for mental illness. It's not the same if somebody's struggling with depression or anxiety. It's like, pull yourself together. What's wrong with you? Why are you worried? You got a nice job, you got a nice house, you got nice kids. It's got nothing to do with that.
Yeah.
And I think that sense of the ability to be open, and I think within a workplace, you see, I think sometimes, it's not always about going to human resources or whatever they might be called in a particular organisation. Yeah. It's knowing there's the network there. And so I think, a lot of the organisations now, I remember when I was growing up as a kid, and physical first aid was really just taking off. We were taught it in school and all that. Well, mental health first aid is taking off now. And those organisations that give people time, it only takes a day. You go off and you train. When you've come back, you're part of the network, and there's a network within a company. I think all companies should be doing that now.
I was really struck in your book by the power of good leadership in terms of how you felt that, or particularly you talk about Richard Stott, you talk about Tony Blair, and how they would allow your mental illness to define you as a person in your role. Do you still think that there's quite a big leadership gap in business and industry with regards? Yeah, I do. And not just in industry. I met a nurse recently who works in the National Health Service, and she was telling me she daren't tell any of her colleagues that she's bipolar.
because she's convinced that will be held against her. And she may be right. And I said to her, I hope you're wrong. She said, I know I'm right. I know they just won't understand. And so I keep it to myself. And I thought, God, she's a nurse, you know, she works for the National Health Service. And it also means, for example, she was telling me she gets her children to lie for her so that when she's really depressed and she can't face going to work, she gets one of her children to phone the ward to say that she can't come in because her sister's ill, her little sister's ill. Then she tells the little sister, who's 5, sorry, love, you can't go to school today, because she's worried about dropping her off at school because the other nurses will see her. And I mean, that's just crazy. But I think that is prevalent. But then you see signs of change. So who was the guy, the boss of a big company recently that got the boot for saying something?
It was one of the big.
One of the big consultancies, wasn't it? And you know, he sort of said something.
Yeah.
A bit silly.
Yeah.
A bit in the realms of, you know, what have you got to be depressed about?
Yeah.
You know, and so it is changing. It is changing, but I think it will only really get to that tipping point that we need if people in positions of leadership say, like the woman at the Bank of Ireland, this is how we're going to make the change. And then that ripples out through an organisation.
And getting to that place, is that just a generational change that is going to have to happen? Is that something that can be trained? Is that a changing a state of mind? Is it education? How do you move an entire sector's leadership towards a better place then? It's
all of those things. It's all of those things. But I do think I am a real believer in the leadership by example. I mean, it's interesting, that Bank of Ireland thing, so there I go again. I've worked with several banks. That's the first time I've actually heard somebody at the top of a bank say that. Well, I'll be saying that now every time I talk about mental health.
Yes.
And there might be, you know, the next time, maybe, I don't know, maybe there might be somebody who's heading an organisation, a senior in an organisation, that's interesting. I haven't thought of doing that. Maybe I should do that. And that's, I think, how, you never know when and where the change comes.
Yeah.
I mean, I often think about I think one of the best things we did as a government, the whole smoking, you know, banning smoking in public places and workplaces and stuff. Well, I often think, where did the change come in that? It wasn't the legislation. The legislation was at the end of the change, if you like. The change came with a sense of people just demanding that change and campaigning for it. Do you remember ASH, the campaign, Action on Smoking and Health? We used to treat them like eccentrics. Right, and I can't remember any of their names, but they won. Fair play to them. They just kept going. So I think where campaign change comes from, you can never quite work out where it is. But I feel, the reason I enjoy the mental health campaigning, I sort of feel it's like that. It's moving in the right direction, and it will eventually we'll sit around and we'll say, God, blimey, do you know that it used to be like if you had, I don't know, OCD, schizophrenia, you had, you know, bipolar, that people thought you couldn't do a proper job.
Yes.
You know, people will look back and think, now, of course, there are some people who are mentally ill who can't do a job, and that will always be the case. But, you know, you talk about employers and definition. My brother had schizophrenia. He had a job for 27 years. He was a very good musician. And Glasgow University, where he worked, I say, they never defined him as a schizophrenic. He was an employee who had schizophrenia, and they had to manage it from time to time.
Absolutely. And you talk again, going back to the book, very passionately about friends and family around you. And as you say, a key part of the takeaways from the book is the impact that depression and mental health issues can have, not just on the individual, but the loved ones around it. From your experience, what is the best way for those people around someone who's got mental health issues or is unwell to offer support?
It's hard. And I mean, I also talk there about my own son, for example, Callum, who, you know, had alcoholism. And even though I'd had a drink problem in roughly the same age, I made all the same mistakes with him that people made with me, because you just get so desperate and you just, you know, you say, you don't need to drink. Why are you drinking when you don't need to? And, you know, you just find yourself making the same mistakes. I'd say two things, actually. The first is be there for them, whatever state they're in. You know, just and even if, like I mentioned, my brother, I love my brother dearly, and he died a few years ago now. But I mean, he could drive me crazy. He could drive me absolutely crazy. I'd be working in Downing Street, and he would phone, and I'd be in a meeting, and I'd ignore the call, and he'd phone again 20 seconds later, and he'd phone a minute later, and eventually I'd think, oh, go answer the bloody phone, and I'd answer the phone and say, hey, how are you? How are you? Just for a chat, right? And then half an hour later, phone again. How you doing? Are you okay? And but that was when he was a bit kind of, haywire. That was part of his behaviour. So be there for them. That's the first thing. But then the second thing is, and I think this is the most interesting thing that comes out of Fiona's chapter. I did an interview recently. I bet you didn't know there was a magazine just for psychiatrists. Well, there is. And I did an interview for it. And they said, what was the most important thing you've taken from your psychiatrist? Which I'd never been asked before. And so I thought through all the exercises to do with him and all that. And I said, do you know what I think the most important thing was? It was when I'd been seeing him for a while. He said, look, we talk a lot about Fiona, my partner, and your children here. I'd like to meet them. Okay, fine. They came along. And the reason he wanted to meet them was he wanted to say to them, they must never, ever blame themselves for my depression. And what's interesting is that Fiona's chapter says that was a turning point, because the truth is she did blame herself. Right. And if I'm being brutally frank and honest about myself, I allowed her to do that because why wouldn't I want to blame somebody else rather than say, this is your responsibility? And I think that is what people, mental illness, the reason it's so awful is it literally plays tricks with your mind. Yeah. So, yeah, you're right. You should take the blame for this, not me. And so you find yourself, because you feel miserable, you want other people to share that, when in fact is the wrong thing to do. Mm. And what the other person should do is not absorb it. Right. Not take the blame. Not say, yes, I'll feel as shit as you do. And what Fiona does now, actually, and when we first started this approach, it can feel like she's being very hard. But actually, all she's doing is saying, right, well, David, the psychiatrist, he said, I mustn't blame myself. I'm not going to. I'm going to pretend nothing's happening. I'll be there for you. Yeah. I'll talk to you if you want to talk, but if you don't, I'm not just going to sit here in silence with you. You can sit in silence on your own, and I'll go and do something else. And likewise with my children, I'm now, I mean, they've all moved out now, but when they were living with us, when I first started, after that first meeting, I sat them all down and I said to them, listen, you really need to listen to what David said. It is never your fault. Mm. And if anything, you're three of the very, very small number of people who can actually lift me when I'm like this. Yeah, yeah. So, but it's hard. But what I think was really interesting since the book came out is Fiona was inundated with people saying, that is me. Wow. I'm the person and I don't know how to deal with it. Yeah. And she's now got this little online group going, and they get together and they just talk about, how they deal with it. And I think that can help as well. That sense of, it's kind of a bit modelled on Al-Anon, where the families of alcoholics, that group. And but yeah, I would say it's harder sometimes, because when you're the ill person, when you're the one with the problem, you get the attention. You get the doctor, you get the pills, you get all that. The family just have to kind of get on with it. Absolutely. And the relationship then with those outside your inner circle, with the people you're working with, I guess, is it different again? How as a line manager can you manage those situations better? How do they help in a situation? I'm guessing it must be very different to your inner circle of friends and families. Yeah, although I found when I was, I'm very much kind of one of life's freelancers now, but I work in different organisations, and it is interesting how once you're out there, I mean, I never get through a day without, if I'm out and about, somebody just coming up to me and saying, do you mind if I talk to you? Yeah. And it'll be about something that they're dealing with, or a colleague or a family member or whatever. And I'd say within kind of the office environment, I think what's important is that and this is part of leadership, by the way, that you do build that sense of a community that people can be open with each other. Right. And, it's like sometimes you don't want to go to your line manager, you don't want to go to your boss, But you might want to go to somebody that you trust who can help you make the judgment as to whether this is something to take to a line manager, whether it is something to take to a boss, or whether actually, you know what we're talking about here? You're talking about a medical issue where you really need to go and get proper help. And I think you'd feel better if you did that. And I also think you'd feel better if we told people that's what was going on. Now, it may be held against them. I don't know. But I think we're only going to get to that place of total openness if we all kind of decide we're going to make that leap together.
When did you decide to make the leap yourself?
I didn't really have a choice, to be honest, because, well, I did have a choice, I guess, because what happened with me, I had a breakdown in the 80s, which I describe in the book, and I was like quite a high-flying, young Fleet Street hotshot. So around the media, it got out. I'd been arrested, I'd been behaving bizarrely in a public place, I was taken to hospital, I came back, I had to take quite a lot of time off. So all sorts of stories went around. And I just decided, sod it, when I go back, I've heard all these crazy stories about what happened, I'll just tell people what happened. And then what happened, when I started working for Tony Blair, I remember when I finally said yes, which is after a month of saying no, I said to him, why don't we have a bet about when these following stories come up in the press? Being a bit, troublesome at football matches, writing pornography when I was a student, nervous breakdown, and drink problem, okay? And the answer is, day one, all 4 News of the World. And when they phoned up and said, oh yeah, we're just doing a piece about da-da-da-da, and they answered these questions, and it was an instinctive thing. About the mental health stuff. It was just instinctive. I thought, I'm not going to deny it. Yeah. I'm not going to say this is none of your business. I'm not going to say this is in the past. I just said, yeah, absolutely right. And I've never, ever, ever, ever regretted that.
Fantastic. So we're almost out of time. I think that my last question, and thank you so much, so interesting, I could continue talking for ages, was that anyone watching here who might be struggling themselves, what would your advice be to them at the moment?
Look, it's really hard to advise people kind of in the abstract, but, and I do get, with that nurse that I mentioned, I can understand specific circumstances where you might think, I don't want to be open. But I talk a lot about Charles Kennedy, who was a friend of mine, and I tried to encourage him to be open about his drinking. And I felt the only way he was going to crack it was if he was open about it. He'd find he'd get public support, not public. He might get some approbation, but so what? You don't care about those people. You get a lot of public support, and what's more, it would give it. He'd be out there then. He'd be able to say, right, I'm going to crack this. And I actually had him at one point booked into the place where my son went, a rehab place up in Scotland, and he found a reason not to go and so forth. So I would say, general advice: find the person that you feel you can be open with. Be open with them and let them help you. And if they think, do you know what, maybe you need to go and get some proper professional help, try to get it. And the more you just bottle it up inside, the worse it's going to get.
Fantastic place to finish. Alastair, thank you so much.
Thank you, I enjoyed it.
Wonderful talking to you. Thank you.